Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa. I'm Clarisse Fortuné. Our top stories. COP28 kicks off with a surprise announcement, a pledge for $420 million to help nations suffering from the effects of global warming. Also among the climate solutions, renewable energy, solar and wind power have taken off in Senegal, but the country is not about to let go of fossil fuels. It has barely started and it's already been called a historic moment. The 28th edition of the UN Climate Summit has pledged a $420 million fund to support the countries hit by global warming. The announcement was made by COP28 President Sultan Al Jaber, who said there was no time to waste.
The next 2 weeks will not be easy. Let's remember, our task is not only about negotiating text or putting words on paper. It is about improving lives. It is about people.
2 weeks of talks and African nations have high expectations for this summit. Chloe Demat is in Dubai and she met some of their representatives.
COP28 just kicked off here in Dubai, and of course Africa and the dire consequences of climate change there are going to be a big part of the discussions over the next 2 weeks. Now, just walking around the premises a little bit, I was able to speak with some of the participants that flew in from African nations. A delegation from Senegal, for example, was saying that they were very eager to explore partnership opportunities for green infrastructure and renewable energy. I also met with 2 young girls from Mali, 17 and 20 years old. They were part of a UNICEF delegation, and they said they were very excited to meet with participants from other countries and try and find solutions to very specific problems they are facing at home, such as water scarcity, but also diseases such as malaria that are rapidly spreading in areas where waste water is not properly managed. So here, overall, expectations are pretty high, especially among developing countries. And today there was a first important announcement. The participating countries have agreed to roll out the loss and damage fund that was initially announced last year at COP27. Now, the fund is supposed to help and compensate developing countries, including a lot of African nations, to help them cope with the consequences of climate change. Tomorrow also should be a very big day, with the head of states taking the floor and giving speeches with potentially even more announcements.
And the Loss and Damage Fund was announced as Africa is grappling with the deadliest impacts of a heating planet. Just recently, more than 2 million people across the Horn of Africa have been forced from their homes by torrential rains and floods. And near 300 people have also lost their lives in Somalia, Kenya and Ethiopia. Nazanine Moshiri is a crisis group's senior analyst for climate, environment and conflict for Africa. I asked her earlier about the significance of his new pledge for African nations.
This is a really significant announcement at COP, I really have to say, and quite surprising because the negotiations for the Loss and Damage Fund have been quite difficult. The main sticking point was, first of all, who's going to host the fund. And it seems that there has been an agreement that the World Bank will temporarily host the fund. And secondly, who is going to kick off the funding for the financing of the Loss and Damage Fund. And this big announcement, so $429 million or 225 million euros, is going to come mainly from the EU, we understand, also some money from the UK and the US and Japan. This is a big boost, but still, there is still a lot to be done. If you just think about the floods a few years ago in Pakistan, the damage from the floods in Pakistan were around $30 billion. And at the moment, this fund is about $429 million. So not only will the fund need a lot more money, but also a lot more guarantees that it's going to make it to countries, particularly in the African continent, that are suffering from both climate fragility and also suffering from conflict as well.
So what do you think, how these African nations should approach these discussions?
Well, I think the African group of negotiators, which are led by Zambia, they're calling for, of course, the loss and damage fund was among the main issues. They wanted it operationalized. It's a lifeline for African countries experiencing shocks already. And they will want to know, how is a decision going to be made about who gets some of that funding? How is it going to be dispersed? So I think that's one of the main issues for the African group of negotiators. But along with that, separate to the loss and damage, in 2015 in Paris, there was an agreement made by richer developed countries to give developing countries $100 billion a year in climate financing. That promise still has not been fulfilled, and that's separate to the loss and damage fund. And it's really important that that promise is fulfilled, and that money, particularly for countries which are vulnerable in Africa, comes in the form of grants rather than loans. The last thing many African countries need are more loans, particularly during these difficult economic times.
So you've said it, there's many pledges already done. So is there anything that has been achieved so far?
Yes, it's still early days. Obviously, this is just the first day of COP being launched. And I think, despite all the controversy over the UAE hosting COP, it does seem to be that the UAE is already been able to provide a breakthrough in these very difficult areas. But there's still a lot more work to be done and more progress to be done, particularly on global goals for greening the energy economy, and also, as I mentioned, clarifying the financial assistance that rich nations should provide to poorer nations, particularly in Africa, for climate action.
And let's talk a bit about what's at stake now. We talk about floods and droughts and the consequences, but also the question of security.
Yes, we at Crisis Group, we're not saying there are direct links between climate change and conflict. There are indirect links. But what's really important this year, for the first time, there is going to be a focus on peace, relief and recovery, which is happening on the 3rd of December. Now, the UAE is basically coming out with a declaration which many countries and international organizations are going to sign. I've read that declaration. It isn't legally binding, but what it is a really high-level recognition that people in fragile, conflict-hit settings have been left behind for many years by the world in terms of climate action. And that conflict isn't merely just a side issue, it's an integral part of the equation, and it really need a kind of integrated approach when we're looking at peace building, climate action, humanitarian action, development programming, and this is really important, and it's significant that this is going to be on the agenda at COP this year.
COP28 President Sultan Al-Jaber also said that the role of fossil fuels should be included in a deal at the UN's climate talks, just as Senegal is about to start extracting oil and gas in the coming month. But solar power and wind power projects have also taken off in the country in recent years. 31% of the country's electricity is now produced from renewable energy. Eliman Dao, Sarah Sako and Sam Bradpiece reports.
This wind power plant, just to the north of the Senegalese capital, is the largest in West Africa. With 46 turbines spread over 35 hectares, this site provides enough electricity to meet the needs of more than 2 million people.
It represents a significant chunk of the country's energy mix. This plant accounts for 15% of electricity production. The solar energy plant accounts for 15%. That's up to 30% of our overall production.
Senegal raised $3 billion in funding back in June during a Paris summit focused on development of green energy projects. The country is aiming to produce 40% of its electricity from renewable sources by 2030 and is seen as a climate leader in the region.
Senegal is really making progress in renewable energy with all this investment. Other countries in the region could follow this example. Renewable energy is really the solution we need when it comes to sustainable development.
But the country is not abandoning fossil fuels just yet. Senegalese President Macky Sall recently reaffirmed his desire to begin extracting untapped oil and gas deposits in the coming months.
In developed countries today, there is coal, oil, and gas. So we shouldn't have to suffer climate injustice. The main issue for us is that we should be able to exploit the resources available to us to satisfy our needs in terms of industrialization and universal access to electricity.
Once extraction begins, Senegal is expected to generate 1.4 billion euros from oil and gas over 2 years, largely through sales to EU countries like Germany.
17 people have died from anthrax in Uganda. Authorities say the victim might have eaten meat from a farm in Kyotera district where animals had contracted the deadly bacteria, a very rare disease that the Ugandan government now claims to have under control. Details in the region from Clément de Roma.
At least 40 people have been infected and 17 have died from a localized outbreak of anthrax 180 kilometers south of the Ugandan capital. This bacterium has been present in the region since October, and authorities were investigating what was then a mysterious illness. The government says it's now controlling the infection, which is transmitted from cows and goats to humans. It causes skin and lung infections, which can become fatal. The African Center for Disease Control, or CDC, had ruled out the theory of anthrax a few days ago before a new analysis confirmed its presence. Anthrax became famous in 2001 through letters containing spores sent to American politicians and newspapers, resulting in multiple deaths. Kampala is still on high alert for deadly health warnings following its last Ebola epidemic a year ago, which killed 55 people.
And with this, we end this edition of Eye on Africa. Thank you for watching and stay with us for more news.